The first Thanksgiving has become the subject of folklore, similar to Washington chopping down a cherry tree or Johnny Appleseed. It can be easy to forget that the event actually occurred, and we have real documents from the time discussing how it actually played out. So does the popular story of Thanksgiving stack up with reality? Today we'll be discussing the Pilgrims' original Thanksgiving. To truly understand Thanksgiving, we need to discuss the context that led up to it. On November 11th, 1620, the Mayflower dropped its anchor at the northern tip of Cape Cod. On board were about 100 passengers and a couple dozen crew members. While in port, the colony's men signed the Mayflower Compact, which organized them into a democratic government. Soon after, they discovered Plymouth and began settling the area. Immediately, they were struck by diseases, which was made even worse by the lack of food and harsh winter. Half of the colony died in a few short months, and at some points, 2 or 3 died every day. Luckily, by the time spring came around, the disease epidemic had subsided, and they could begin growing crops. It was at this time that a bold Indian waltzed in their settlement and greeted them in English. The Indian's name was Samoset, and he came in peace as a representative of a larger tribe. This tribe, the Wampanoags, were led by their great chief Massasoit, who was seeking an alliance with this new group of Englishmen. Massasoit had his own enemies before the English Pilgrims showed up. Notably, he feared the Narragansetts in modern-day Rhode Island. He saw the opportunity of helping these new settlers and securing a European ally with modern weapons and outside support. He sent to Squantum, also known as Squanto, to help familiarize the Pilgrims with the area, showing them how to grow New England crops and teaching them about nearby tribes. Eventually, Massasoit arrived in person and met with the colony's governor. He was met with gifts and accommodation before they began to work out an official treaty. This treaty set the Pilgrims on a road for peace, not just with Massasoit and his men, but with all their neighbors as well. Relations between the two were great, and the Pilgrims' position in America was finally secure. By fall of 1621, their crops were ready to be harvested, and the Pilgrims were ecstatic about their survival. As was the custom back in England, they held a feast celebrating the successful harvest. It is from the story of this feast that Thanksgiving originates. We only have one first-hand account of this feast. It comes from Edward Winslow in a letter to his friends back in England. Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent 4 men on fowling that so we might after a more special manner rejoice together, after we gathered the fruit of our labors. They 4 in one day killed as much fowl as, with a little help beside, served the company almost a week. At which time, amongst their recreations, we exercised our arms, many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king, Massasoit with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor, and upon the captain and others. And although it be not always so plentiful as it was at this time with us, yet by the goodness of God we are so far from want that we often wish you partakers in our plenty. From this source alone we can establish a timeline of what happened at the first Thanksgiving. After about a year in New England, the Pilgrims' crops were finally ready to be harvested. Their yield was large, so in celebration, they decided they would hold a feast. They sent out 4 men hunting for birds who were extremely successful. When they returned, the feast began. As part of the colony's celebration, they fired their weapons into the air, accidentally alerting their Wampanoag allies. When they arrived to check on the Pilgrims, they were invited to join the feast. There were 90 Wampanoags who ate with them, and this included Chief Massasoit. At one point, the Indians were hunting and brought back 5 deer, which they gave to the Pilgrims. After 3 days, the feast ended, and their Indian allies returned home. The colony itself was prosperous and had a surplus of food left over. This source gives us a lot of information about the feast, but it is also missing several key details. Most obviously, it never mentions a date, meaning that we really have no idea when the first Thanksgiving happened. On that note, it also never uses the word Thanksgiving, or even thanks for that matter. This is likely because at this time, Thanksgivings were religious observances, when people would thank God for his blessing and would usually fast instead of eat. This is in stark contrast to the Pilgrims' feast, which was not exceptionally religious, instead being a harvest festival. Of course, they surely thanked God for the good harvest and prosperity, but this is something they practiced every time they ate. The feast was also antithetical to the fasting that would usually occur during a Thanksgiving. This discrepancy is because the term Thanksgiving was only applied to the event later, once it became a holiday. The source also makes little mention of what they ate, though we can assume since we have a general idea of what both the Pilgrims and their guests' diets consisted of. A mixture of traditional Wampanoag and English foods were eaten, and it's even likely that new recipes were invented on the spot. The colony only had 4 adult women, and it was their job to feed a total of 140 people for 3 days. They received help from the children and servants, but even then it was a monumental task. As for eating the food, people only had personal spoons and knives. Forks, on the other hand, were still a luxury item that had not made its way to the lower classes. The most prominent men would have chairs, others benches, and given they had 90 unexpected visitors, most found their own seating on the ground or atop a tree stump. For entertainment, they danced, played games, sang songs, listened to speeches, and generally kept themselves busy. Over time, the first Thanksgiving has evolved into the American holiday we know it as today. While the specifics may have shifted, the underlying purpose remains the same. Both then and now, the holiday is a celebration of family, prosperity, and unity. Their story captivates us to this day because it's unique and has depth to it. 2 extremely different groups coming together to feast. The survival and triumph over disastrous conditions and death. The successful adventure across the ocean into an unknown land. All of these come together to make the story of the first Thanksgiving impact and resonate with those who hear it. Stories of peace, joy, love, and success are unfortunately outnumbered across history by death, bleak conditions, and hatred. That's why we must cherish and celebrate this brilliant American holiday, and pass it on so that future generations can also take their seat at the table, in between the Pilgrims on one side and the Founding Fathers on the other, sitting with all those that came before and since at the great American dinner table.